You don't belong in first class. Claire Donovan's voice cracked through the quiet cabin with the sharp certainty of someone who believed authority could never be questioned. Heads turned before Marcus Whitfield even looked up from the boarding pass in his hand. The polished aisle of Flight 742 suddenly felt smaller, the silence heavier, as dozens of passengers paused mid-conversation to watch what they assumed would be another routine dispute. Marcus stood still in a plain charcoal hoodie, dark jeans, clean white sneakers, and a simple black backpack slung over one shoulder. Nothing about him matched the picture Claire had already painted in her mind. Not to her. Not to the businessman sipping sparkling water in row 2. Not to the older couple already exchanging knowing glances across the aisle. Claire folded her arms with practiced confidence. Sir, economy is toward the back. You're holding up our premium passengers. Marcus lowered his eyes to the boarding pass again, as though confirming what he already knew. Seat 1A. His name. His reservation. Every detail exactly as it should be. Then he calmly looked back at Claire. I believe you're mistaken. She didn't even glance at the ticket. No, she replied, louder this time. I'm not. A few passengers shifted in their seats, pretending not to stare while making sure they missed nothing. Across the aisle, a white businessman in a tailored navy suit smirked under his breath. Another passenger quietly whispered, Here we go again. Marcus had heard those words before. Different airport. Different faces. Same assumption. It was never about the ticket. It was never about policy. It was always about what someone believed success should look like. Claire extended her hand without patience. Boarding pass. Marcus handed it to her without protest. She barely looked at the barcode before shaking her head. This isn't your seat. Her tone carried the confidence of a verdict already decided. Marcus remained perfectly calm. Would you mind scanning it again? Claire laughed softly, just loud enough for nearby passengers to hear. I don't need another scan to know when something doesn't add up. The businessman across the aisle chuckled in agreement. Somewhere near the galley, a young flight attendant named Emily Carter glanced toward the exchange with visible concern. She had watched the boarding scanner flash green less than 2 minutes earlier. She remembered the name because it was unusual. Marcus Whitfield. Everything had cleared. She looked from Marcus to Claire, hesitating, unsure whether to speak. Marcus never noticed her. His attention stayed fixed on Claire, whose expression hardened with every passing second. Sir, she announced, I'm asking you one final time to leave the first-class cabin before we involve airport security. The cabin grew so quiet that even the distant hum of the air conditioning seemed louder. Marcus slowly inhaled, not with anger, but with the patience of someone who had survived moments exactly like this long before today. 23 years earlier, he had been told he didn't belong inside an executive airport lounge after closing the biggest business deal of his young career. He remembered standing there holding valid credentials while strangers decided his worth before hearing his name. He remembered promising himself that if success ever found him, dignity would never leave him behind. That promise had carried him through failed startups, impossible negotiations, billion-dollar acquisitions, and countless rooms where people underestimated the quiet man in ordinary clothes. Today felt painfully familiar. Only this time, the stakes were much higher than a seat on an airplane. Claire stepped aside and pointed toward the rear cabin. Last chance. Marcus looked down the aisle, then calmly met her eyes again. I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be. Claire Donovan did not move. She stood between Marcus Whitfield and Seat 1 Alpha as though the narrow aisle belonged to her instead of the airline. The polished cabin lights reflected against the silver nameplate on her uniform, while the rest of the passengers waited to see who would blink first. Marcus did not. His expression remained steady, almost unreadable, the kind of calm that unsettled people who expected confrontation. Claire reached for the boarding pass again, this time holding it between 2 fingers as though it deserved less respect than every other ticket she had collected that afternoon. She glanced at the name for less than a second before looking back at Marcus instead of the document. This reservation cannot be right, she said. People make fake boarding passes every day. Marcus answered with the same measured tone. Then scan it one more time. Claire folded the paper without doing what he asked. I do not need another machine telling me what common sense already has. A quiet laugh came from Richard Hale, the businessman seated across the aisle. He adjusted the cuff of his expensive jacket and smiled at Claire. You are delaying departure over someone who obviously wandered into the wrong cabin. Claire nodded slightly, grateful for the support. Exactly. Emily Carter remained near the boarding door, her tablet still open in her hands. She could see Marcus's passenger record on the screen. Green status. Verified identification. Paid first class. No alerts. No restrictions. Every line confirmed that seat 1 Alpha belonged to him. Her fingers tightened around the tablet. She wanted to speak, but she was only 6 weeks into her first assignment with Aeronova Airlines. Training had taught her to respect senior crew decisions. Her conscience was teaching her something very different. Marcus quietly slipped his phone from his pocket and checked the time. For minutes had passed since he stepped onto the aircraft. Every second revealed more than any corporate report ever could. That was precisely why he had boarded dressed exactly as he was now. No tailored suit. No luxury watch. No executive assistant walking beside him. No photographers. No recognition. Only a regular passenger carrying an ordinary backpack. 3 months earlier, anonymous customer reports had reached his office describing passengers who claimed they were treated differently based on appearance instead of policy. Executives dismissed them as isolated incidents. Marcus never believed problems disappeared simply because they became inconvenient to discuss. He believed leadership required seeing the truth with his own eyes. Claire extended her arm toward the rear of the aircraft. There are empty seats in economy. We can avoid this entire situation if you cooperate. Marcus looked past her toward seat 1 Alpha, then back into her eyes. I paid for the seat that appears on my boarding pass. Richard Hale leaned farther into the aisle. Some people should appreciate any seat they are offered. A few passengers looked away, uncomfortable with the comment but unwilling to challenge it. Others silently watched, waiting for someone else to intervene. Emily finally took one cautious step forward. Her voice was quiet enough that only Claire could hear. I checked his boarding record when he scanned. Everything matched. Claire's smile disappeared. Without turning her head, she answered through clenched teeth. Go finish your boarding responsibilities. Emily hesitated. But his seat is valid. Claire finally faced her, her voice remaining perfectly controlled even as her eyes hardened. That was not a suggestion. Emily stepped back, but the doubt had already spread through the front cabin. Marcus noticed the exchange without saying a word. Silence, he knew, often revealed more about people than arguments ever could. Around him, passengers exchanged uncertain glances as the atmosphere shifted from simple inconvenience to something much more difficult to ignore. Irritation spread through the first-class cabin like a slow-moving storm. Watches were checked. Seat belts remained unfastened. Conversations faded into whispers that bounced quietly between rows. Flight 742 had not moved an inch from the gate, and every passing moment deepened the uncomfortable question hanging over everyone watching. Why was one passenger being treated as though he had done something wrong when he had done nothing except remain beside the seat printed on his boarding pass? Claire Donovan refused to let that question settle. She turned toward the front galley and called out, "Bradley, I need you up here." Seconds later, Bradley Mills appeared with the relaxed confidence of someone convinced he already understood the situation before hearing a single fact. He looked Marcus up and down, then exchanged a quick glance with Claire. Neither of them bothered asking for an explanation. Bradley smiled politely, but there was nothing welcoming about it. "Sir, we have procedures for situations like this." Marcus answered evenly. "Then I would appreciate you following them." Bradley folded his arms. "We already are." Claire handed him the boarding pass without another scan. Bradley barely looked at the barcode before returning it. "This document does not match what we are seeing." Marcus tilted his head slightly. "What exactly are you seeing?" Bradley shrugged. "Someone trying to sit where he does not belong." Richard Hale laughed again, louder this time. "I told you this would happen." They always argue instead of accepting the solution. A few passengers shifted uncomfortably. Others stared out the windows, pretending the exchange had nothing to do with them. Yet nobody could completely ignore the growing tension filling the front of the aircraft. Emily Carter remained frozen near the boarding door. The passenger manifest still glowed on her tablet. Marcus Whitfield. Seat 1 Alpha. Status verified. She quietly opened the boarding history once more. Green check mark. Time stamped exactly 7 minutes earlier. There was no mistake. There never had been. She swallowed hard and looked toward Bradley. His boarding record still shows valid. Bradley answered without even turning toward her. Close the tablet. Emily hesitated. But the system, Claire interrupted before she could finish. The system is not running this cabin. We are. The words lingered in the air longer than anyone expected. Marcus watched both of them carefully. They spoke about policy, yet neither had relied on the one thing policy demanded most: verification. Instead, every decision had been based on appearance. His hoodie, his backpack, his skin. The pattern was becoming impossible to miss. Bradley stepped toward seat 1 Alpha and gestured to Richard Hale. Sir, would you mind waiting here for just another minute? Richard smiled. Of course. Bradley then looked back at Marcus. We have another passenger who actually belongs in this section, and we cannot continue boarding while you block the aisle. Marcus glanced toward Richard, then back toward Bradley. Interesting choice of words. Bradley frowned. Meaning? Marcus answered quietly. You said another passenger who belongs here. I never heard you say another passenger with a confirmed reservation. Bradley's expression tightened for the first time. Around them, more passengers began paying attention. A woman in row 3 slowly lowered her magazine. A retired school principal named Linda Foster removed one earbud after listening to nearly the entire exchange. Across the aisle, a college student named Daniel Brooks discreetly opened the camera on his phone before stopping himself. Marcus noticed the movement immediately. Please, he said calmly, do not record this because it is dramatic. Remember it because it matters. Daniel lowered the phone without argument. Emily looked at Marcus with quiet surprise. Most people in his position would have demanded attention. He was asking for something entirely different. Truth. And somewhere deep inside the cabin, that single word began changing the direction of the room. Emily Carter could no longer convince herself that staying silent was the safe choice. Every lesson she had learned during training about professionalism suddenly felt incomplete without one simple word: integrity. She took another careful step toward the front of the cabin, holding the tablet close to her chest, as though it carried something far more important than passenger records. Claire Donovan noticed immediately. Emily, she said firmly, return to your position. Emily drew a slow breath, but remained where she stood. I already checked his reservation twice, she said quietly. The system confirms seat 1 Alpha belongs to Mr. Marcus Whitfield. The words settled over the cabin with surprising weight. Several passengers looked toward Claire instead of Marcus for the first time. Bradley Mills quickly answered before Claire could speak. You are still in training. You do not understand every operational procedure. Emily kept her voice respectful. Maybe not every procedure, but I know how to read a verified boarding record. Bradley extended his hand. Give me the tablet. Emily hesitated for only a moment before handing it over. Bradley glanced at the screen, his expression changing almost too quickly to notice. The green verification was still there. Passenger checked in. Identity confirmed. First class. Seat 1 Alpha. He immediately locked the screen and lowered the device before anyone else could see it. There are additional security factors you are not aware of, he said. Marcus listened without interruption. He had spent decades sitting across negotiation tables where people tried to create certainty out of assumptions. The language was always familiar. Vague explanations. Undefined policies. Invisible rules that somehow appeared only after someone decided he did not belong. Claire regained her composure and addressed the passengers instead of Marcus. Ladies and gentlemen, we apologize for the delay. We are resolving a documentation issue. Linda Foster slowly stood from row 3. Her calm voice carried farther than she expected. Documentation issue? I have been listening for nearly 10 minutes. I have not heard anyone explain what is actually wrong with his ticket. Claire offered a practiced smile. Ma'am, we appreciate your patience, but this is a crew matter. Linda nodded once. Respectfully, it became a passenger matter the moment everyone in this cabin was asked to watch someone being judged before his ticket was even scanned. Silence followed. Daniel Brooks looked from Linda to Marcus, then quietly spoke without raising his phone. She is right. Another passenger added from farther back. If the computer cleared him, why is he still standing? Richard Hale crossed his arms and shook his head. The crew knows more than the rest of us. Let them do their jobs. Marcus finally looked toward Richard. His expression remained calm, almost sympathetic. Trust in a system is important, he said. But trust becomes dangerous when nobody asks whether the system is actually being followed. Emily lowered her eyes. Those words struck harder than she expected because they described exactly what she had witnessed. Claire felt the mood shifting. The quiet confidence she carried only minutes earlier was beginning to crack beneath the weight of too many unanswered questions. She reached toward the boarding pass once more and folded it neatly before slipping it into her uniform pocket. This document will remain with us until this matter is resolved. Marcus watched the movement without taking a single step forward. You are keeping my boarding pass? Claire answered without hesitation. Correct. Marcus nodded slowly, as though confirming something only he understood. Thank you, he said. Claire frowned. For what? Marcus looked around the cabin, meeting the eyes of Emily, Linda, Daniel, and several passengers who were no longer looking away. For making it perfectly clear that this stopped being about a seat several minutes ago. The cabin had reached the point where every quiet sound seemed amplified. The soft chime from the boarding door, the rustle of newspapers, the distant conversation from the jet bridge outside. Yet the loudest thing inside the aircraft was the silence surrounding Marcus Whitfield. Nobody could explain why a verified passenger was still standing in the aisle without his boarding pass. Claire Donovan reached for the cabin intercom, paused, then chose another path instead. She turned toward Bradley Mills. Contact airport operations. Tell them we have a disruptive passenger refusing crew instructions. Marcus did not interrupt. Bradley nodded and stepped several feet away, speaking into his company radio with carefully selected words. We have a passenger creating a boarding issue in the first-class cabin. We may require assistance before departure. None of those words described what everyone in the cabin had actually witnessed. Emily Carter lowered her head. The description bothered her more than the confrontation itself. Marcus had never raised his voice. He had never blocked anyone's path. He had never ignored a lawful instruction because no lawful explanation had ever been given. The story was already changing before help had even arrived. Marcus slowly looked out the window beside seat 1 Alpha. The airport ramp stretched across the afternoon sun, and for a brief moment the reflection in the glass became another memory. 24 years earlier, he had stood outside an executive lounge in Dallas after completing the largest investment presentation of his young career. He remembered wearing the only business suit he could afford, carrying a leather briefcase with worn corners, and holding a valid lounge pass in his hand. The receptionist looked at the pass for barely a second before saying, "Those invitations are for corporate members." He quietly explained that he was the corporate member. She smiled politely without believing him. A white executive walked in moments later wearing blue jeans, carrying no identification at all, and was welcomed inside with a handshake. Marcus remembered standing alone in that hallway long after everyone else disappeared behind the lounge doors. He remembered promising himself that success would never erase the responsibility to confront moments exactly like that one. The memory faded as the aircraft returned into focus. Claire was still standing between him and his seat. Bradley was still speaking into the radio. Richard Hale was still convinced the crew could not possibly be mistaken. Time had changed everything except the assumptions. Linda Foster finally broke the silence. "Young man," she said gently, looking at Marcus. "How are you staying this calm?" Marcus smiled faintly. "Because anger convinces people they were right to fear you. Patience forces them to face what they actually did." Daniel Brooks quietly nodded. Emily felt those words settle somewhere she would remember for years. Claire turned back toward Marcus with renewed confidence after ending her conversation with Bradley. "Airport operations have been notified. If you continue refusing our instructions, this situation will become much more complicated." Marcus looked directly at her. "Actually, it has become very simple." Claire frowned. "Simple?" Marcus nodded once. "A verified passenger asked for verification. The crew refused verification. Everything that happens after this belongs to the choices you make next." Bradley returned from the front galley. "Operations wants an incident summary before sending anyone aboard." Claire answered immediately. "Tell them the passenger questioned crew authority, delayed boarding, and refused reassignment." Emily instinctively took one step forward before stopping herself. Every sentence she heard left out the same critical detail. Nobody had ever verified the seat after the first scan. Nobody had ever explained why a confirmed reservation suddenly no longer mattered. Around the cabin, passengers were no longer wondering whether something unfair had happened. They were beginning to wonder how much longer the truth could remain hidden. Marcus Whitfield reached into the pocket of his hoodie with the same calm precision he had shown since stepping onto the aircraft. There was no frustration in his movements and no urgency in his expression. He simply removed his phone, unlocked it, and looked at the screen for a brief second before selecting a single contact. Claire Donovan watched with quiet amusement. "Calling someone to complain will not change our decision," she said. Marcus did not respond immediately. The call connected almost instantly. "Dana," he said in an even voice, "I need you to activate ground protocol for Flight 742. Begin a full compliance review and notify the Executive Oversight Committee that I am initiating a live operational audit." On the other end, Dana Brooks answered without hesitation. "Confirmed. Ground protocol is now active. I am alerting legal, corporate compliance, flight operations, and executive security. Estimated confirmation in less than 2 minutes." Marcus thanked her and ended the call. Claire exchanged a glance with Bradley Mills before smiling. That was quite the performance. Bradley folded his arms again. Everyone claims to know someone important when they get caught. Richard Hale laughed openly this time. Maybe he thinks the chief executive officer is going to stop the airplane for him. A few passengers smiled politely, but the laughter faded much faster than Richard expected. Emily Carter had heard every word Marcus spoke. The phrase ground protocol meant nothing to her, yet Dana's response sounded far too structured to be imaginary. There had been no hesitation, no confusion, no questions. It sounded like a process that already existed. Emily quietly opened the internal operations application on her tablet once more. At first, nothing had changed. Then, without warning, a yellow notification banner appeared across the top of the screen. Operational review initiated. Flight departure pending executive authorization. Emily blinked twice, convinced she had misread it. She refreshed the page. The banner remained. Her heartbeat quickened. Bradley noticed her staring at the tablet. "What now?" he asked impatiently. Emily looked up, uncertain whether she should answer. "The flight status just changed." Claire frowned. "Changed how?" Emily swallowed carefully. "Executive review has been placed on this departure." Bradley reached for the tablet, but before he could take it, another notification appeared. "Passenger service modifications temporarily suspended. Manual override required." Claire looked at the screen herself. Her confident expression flickered for the first time. "That has to be a system error," she said quickly. Marcus remained exactly where he had been standing from the beginning. He did not smile. He did not celebrate. He simply watched people discover the consequences of choices they believed would never be questioned. Linda Foster quietly observed Claire's face. Only minutes earlier, the senior flight attendant had spoken with complete certainty. Now she seemed to be searching for explanations instead of giving them. Daniel Brooks leaned toward Linda and whispered, "Something just changed." Linda nodded without taking her eyes off Marcus. "No," she answered softly. "Something just caught up." Bradley immediately picked up the cabin phone and called the cockpit. His voice remained controlled, but the confidence had begun slipping away. "Captain, we just received an executive operations hold on departure." "Yes, right now. I do not know why." A brief silence followed before Bradley slowly lowered the receiver. "The captain wants everyone to remain where they are until operations calls back." Claire looked directly at Marcus. "What exactly did you do?" Marcus met her eyes with the same calm expression that had never left his face. "Nothing unusual," he replied. "I simply gave the company an opportunity to see exactly what its passengers have been experiencing." The cockpit phone rang before anyone inside the first-class cabin spoke another word. Bradley Mills answered immediately, expecting a routine update from flight operations. Instead, the color slowly disappeared from his face. "Understood, Captain," he said quietly before hanging up. Claire Donovan stepped closer. "What happened?" Bradley hesitated. "Operations says this aircraft has been placed under an executive departure hold. Nobody boards. Nobody leaves until corporate authorization is completed." Richard Hale laughed nervously. "Over one passenger? That makes no sense." Marcus Whitfield remained silent. He simply slipped his phone back into his pocket and looked through the cabin windows as baggage carts rolled across the afternoon ramp. The airplane had become completely still, as though time itself had decided to wait. Emily Carter refreshed her tablet once again. This time the yellow banner had turned red. "Executive audit in progress. All passenger service actions under review. Cabin crew decisions being logged." Her eyes widened. She had never seen language like that before, not even during emergency training. Claire reached toward the tablet. "Let me see that." Emily handed it over without resistance. Claire read every line twice. Then a third time. Bradley leaned over her shoulder, and the confidence that had carried both of them through the confrontation began slipping away. "This cannot be right," Claire whispered. Marcus finally spoke. "The system rarely questions itself unless someone gives it a reason." Claire looked directly at him. "Who exactly are you?" Marcus answered with the same calm voice he had used from the beginning. "A passenger who asked for the rules to be applied equally." Claire shook her head. "No ordinary passenger can trigger executive oversight." Marcus did not answer immediately. Instead, he looked around the cabin. Linda Foster was watching quietly. Daniel Brooks sat forward in his seat, completely focused now. Emily stood frozen beside the galley. Even Richard Hale no longer seemed interested in making jokes. Every eye in the cabin had settled on the same man they had overlooked only minutes earlier. Marcus slowly extended his hand toward Claire. "May I have my boarding pass back?" Claire did not move. The folded document remained inside her uniform pocket. Marcus nodded once, almost as though he expected that answer. Then his phone vibrated. He answered on speaker without changing his expression. "Dana." Her voice was clear, professional, and unmistakably urgent. "Everything is confirmed. The Board Oversight Committee is live. The Chief Operating Officer, General Counsel, and Executive Compliance Director are monitoring Flight 742 in real time. They have requested your authorization before taking the next step." The cabin became completely silent. Dana continued. "The audit also confirms that your boarding pass was verified at the gate, your identity was confirmed, and no security concerns were ever issued. Every interaction since boarding has been recorded in the operational log." Claire slowly lowered her eyes. Bradley stared at Marcus without speaking. Richard Hale shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Marcus answered simply, "Thank you, Dana. Hold everyone where they are." "Yes, Mr. Whitfield," Dana replied. "The board will not authorize departure until you finish your review." The call ended. Nobody moved. Nobody even seemed to breathe. Claire looked at Marcus with an expression that had completely replaced certainty with disbelief. "Mr. Whitfield," she whispered, "who are you?" Marcus finally met her eyes. His voice remained low, steady, and impossible to misunderstand. "You told me I did not belong in first class on an aircraft operated by a company whose future I helped decide every single day. You did not delay one passenger today. You delayed the executive chairman who approved the standards this airline promised every traveler would receive. That is why this airplane is not leaving the gate." The words settled over the cabin with the force of complete silence. Nobody reacted immediately because nobody knew how to react. Claire Donovan stood motionless, her hand still resting near the pocket that held Marcus Whitfield's boarding pass. Bradley Mills stared toward the floor, replaying every decision he had made since Marcus stepped aboard. Richard Hale slowly leaned back into his seat, suddenly finding the cabin far less comfortable than it had seemed only minutes before. Emily Carter quietly closed her tablet, not because there was nothing left to read, but because the truth no longer needed another screen to confirm it. It was standing in front of everyone. The cockpit door opened, and Captain Stephen Reynolds stepped into the aisle with measured steps. His face carried none of the confidence usually expected from the person in command of the aircraft. Instead, he looked directly at Marcus. "Mr. Whitfield," he said respectfully, "I have just finished speaking with Corporate Flight Operations and the Executive Oversight Committee." Marcus nodded once. "Thank you for coming out personally, Captain." Stephen took a slow breath before continuing. "This aircraft has officially been placed on an operational ground hold until the review is completed. We have also been instructed to preserve every communication log, passenger manifest update, and crew interaction beginning from boarding." No one spoke. The only sound came from the quiet ventilation system above their heads. Claire finally removed the folded boarding pass from her pocket. Her hands, so steady before, now moved carefully as she extended it toward Marcus. "Your boarding pass, sir." Marcus accepted it without triumph. He unfolded the paper, glanced at seat 1 Alpha, then looked back at Claire. "Thank you." She lowered her eyes. "I should have scanned it again." Marcus answered gently. "You should have trusted the process instead of your assumptions." Bradley stepped forward next. "I repeated conclusions that I never verified. That was my responsibility." Marcus met his gaze. Leadership fails one decision at a time. Accountability begins exactly the same way. Richard Hale slowly stood from the seat he had expected to occupy. The confidence that had colored every comment earlier had completely disappeared. "I owe you an apology," he admitted quietly. "I judged the situation before I understood it." Marcus gave a slight nod. "The important question is whether you will remember this after today." Richard did not answer immediately because he knew the question deserved more than quick words. Captain Reynolds touched the communication panel mounted beside the galley. Seconds later, every crew identification badge emitted the same soft electronic tone. Emily looked down first. Her badge displayed a temporary review notice. Claire's did the same. Bradley's followed a moment later. Captain Reynolds checked the message on his own device before speaking carefully. "Corporate has placed all operational authority for this flight under executive review. Claire Donovan and Bradley Mills are relieved of active passenger service duties pending the outcome of the investigation. They will remain available for interviews after deplaning." Neither argued. Neither protested. The decision had already been made long before the notification reached their badges. Linda Foster quietly smiled, not because anyone had been disciplined, but because fairness had finally entered the room. Daniel Brooks looked toward Marcus with admiration. "You never raised your voice once." Marcus looked around the cabin before answering. "People often believe power is measured by volume. Real leadership is measured by what remains true after everyone stops talking." The cabin stayed silent again, but this silence felt completely different from the one that had greeted Marcus when he first stepped aboard. Earlier it had been filled with judgment. Now it was filled with reflection. And for the first time since boarding began, every passenger in first class understood that the airplane had never been delayed by one man standing in the aisle. It had been delayed by prejudice standing in the way of the truth. Marcus Whitfield looked once more at the boarding pass that had never been invalid. The paper itself had not changed during the past 12 minutes. Only the assumptions surrounding it had. He quietly placed it into his pocket and finally took the few steps towards seat 1 Alpha. No applause filled the cabin. No dramatic celebration interrupted the moment. Instead, passengers instinctively made room, not because they recognized his title, but because they now recognized his humanity. Captain Stephen Reynolds remained near the front of the aircraft. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced calmly, "we appreciate your patience. This flight will remain at the gate until our executive review is formally concluded. Your safety includes the integrity of our procedures, and today those procedures are being examined." No one complained. The frustration that had existed earlier had been replaced by understanding. Emily Carter quietly approached Marcus before returning to her assigned position. "Mr. Whitfield," she said softly, "thank you for reminding me that following policy is not the same as protecting fairness." Marcus offered a warm smile. "Never be afraid to ask one more question when something does not feel right. Good systems become great because honest people refuse to ignore uncomfortable moments." Emily nodded, knowing those words would remain with her long after this flight ended. Linda Foster gathered her handbag and looked toward the front of the cabin. "I taught elementary school for 38 years, she said. "The hardest lesson for children was admitting they judged someone before knowing them. Funny how adults still struggle with the same assignment." Marcus smiled gently. "Learning never ends if we are willing to keep listening." Richard Hale slowly walked forward. There was no trace of the confidence that had defined him earlier. "I cannot undo what I said," he admitted, "but I can make sure I never say it again." Marcus extended his hand, and Richard accepted it without hesitation. "That is where real change begins," Marcus replied. "Not with perfect people, with honest ones." The cabin grew quiet once more as another notification reached the crew devices. Captain Reynolds checked the message before addressing everyone. "Corporate has completed the initial review. A comprehensive investigation will continue after landing. Additional training, policy evaluation, and personnel decisions will follow according to company procedures." Claire Donovan lowered her eyes. Bradley Mills stood silently beside her. Neither tried to defend what had happened because every important fact had already spoken for itself. Marcus looked toward them one final time. "I did not stop this airplane to embarrass anyone," he said. "I stopped it because the next passenger should never have to wonder whether respect depends on appearance. If this review prevents even one person from experiencing what happened today, then these 12 minutes were worth far more than arriving on time." Outside the window, the ground crew resumed preparing the aircraft. Inside the cabin, something far more important had already begun moving forward. It was not the airplane. It was perspective. Captain Reynolds received one final clearance from operations, smiled politely toward Marcus, and announced that boarding procedures would resume under temporary replacement supervision. Passengers quietly returned to their conversations, but the atmosphere no longer resembled the one that had existed before Marcus boarded. It felt lighter, humbler, more aware. Marcus settled into seat 1 Alpha without satisfaction or pride. He simply looked out at the runway stretching toward the horizon. Success had given him influence. Experience had given him patience. But dignity had always been the one thing he refused to negotiate. As the cabin door finally closed and preparations for departure began again, one lesson remained with everyone on board. The greatest measure of leadership is not the power to ground an airplane.